Errand Boy is a really great episode of the middle. This is the 8th episode of the second season. It's directed by Shallat Chemel, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And there are two main parts of the narrative and a little bit involving Axel. I don't have too many thoughts on Axel's, but I will come back to Axel's at the end. But basically he's trying to grow a beard. The other football guys are doing it, and we'll come back to that at the end. Part of the story then focuses on Brick and part on Sue. And I got really emotional with Sue's part because whenever we see Mike being a loving, caring father, or basically doing anything that shows any kind of emotion, I get really emotional at it in response, because he definitely isn't the kind of person who willingly shows his emotions. So when he becomes so passionate about something or so moved by something, it moves me, and this is one of those moments. And I'll talk about that first, then we'll talk about Brick. So Mike is in the car with Sue, Carly and Shannon, two of her friends, and they're talking, and Mike's obviously, he's listening but not trying to listen at the same time, and he kind of overhears that they're going to the movie theatre, but there are going to be boys there, and he's not exactly a fan of this idea. So he decides to take them, but he ends up sitting a few rows behind them to make sure nothing happens. And while Sue goes to the bathroom to get gummy bears out of her braces, Mike hears Shannon talking with Carly. And Shannon invites Carly to a sleepover, but tells her to not tell Sue, because Sue's not invited. And Mike is really annoyed by this and really hurt on Sue's behalf. Obviously, Sue doesn't know, but Mike is aware that she's being excluded for no valid reason. Sue is genuinely a nice person, and there's no reason, as far as we can see, for Shannon to not like her, other than, I guess, not thinking Sue is cool. So Mike, after talking about this, decides to do something that I think is so sweet. And this is the first of a few times I got a little emotional. Sue still doesn't know about the sleepover. She never finds out, at least in the episode. But Mike decides to have a father-daughter date, and they rent Twilight, and they're going to have nice food, and it's going to be a lovely evening. And the fact that he was willing to do that, to make Sue happy, even though I'm 100% confident he had no interest in watching that film, it's something he wanted to do to make Sue happy and to make Sue feel good about herself. And it's so sweet. And then for a couple of seconds, we believe that things might be turning around, because Sue gets a phone call and we hear her talking about a sleeping bag. Now, I did remember what was happening next from the first time, or whenever I've previously seen this. I've seen this episode multiple times, but not in a while. But nevertheless, I could still remember what happened next. But even still, I feel like for a couple of seconds, it's so easy to believe that Shannon had called Sue up to invite her after all, for whatever reason. But we quickly find out that no, Shannon has said her family's going on a last-minute camping trip, and she's asked Sue to borrow her sleeping bag. And Sue, being a kind person, is very willing, and also a wrestlerette wants to borrow her sleeping bag, so she's very excited about this. And Mike is understandably annoyed, because he knows what's really going on, and he tells Sue he'll take the bag over himself, the sleeping bag. And he does, and Shannon's father answers the door, and Mike basically starts to tell him, this is unacceptable, your daughter can't do this to my daughter. And before long, they're basically catfighting and squabbling like teenagers and throwing the sleeping bag, and it's a chaotic little scene, and I rather enjoyed it. And that was another time when I got a little bit emotional at Mike really being a caring, loving father. And one of my favourite bits is when, I didn't write it down, so it's not word for word, but Shannon's father said something like, you know how it is with giving in to your children and doing what they want to make them happy. And Mike turned around and said, no, I don't. Because he doesn't have to give in to Sue wrapping him round her little finger, because she's not like that. She's not manipulative. She's not demanding. And Shannon clearly is. And I think it was a really telling moment about the fact that, yeah, maybe the Hex haven't got the most money. Maybe they're not living the most luxurious lifestyle. But they've raised those children well, with manners and respect. Yeah, the children all have their own issues. But compared to Shannon, really, really exemplary there. And I think that was a really telling moment. And we end with more emotion as they have their father-daughter night after all. And it was really lovely. So I really enjoyed that part of the episode. Then we come to Brick. And at the start of the episode, Frankie is telling Brick it's time to run errands. And Brick says, no, I don't want to. I want to stay home alone. Frankie tells him no, and she tries to tell him that his only other option would be to stay with the aunts, assuming he wouldn't say yes to that, and he did. But it turns out he had a horrible time. So he pleads his case again, and he finds out that both Sue and Axel were already allowed to stay home alone by the time they were Brick's age. And it made me think back to how old I might have been when I was allowed to stay home alone. But I knew it terrified me. I have a brief memory of being about 8 years old, just as an aside here, about 8 years old, and I remember my mother went to the corner shop literally 2-3 minutes away, and I spent the entire time watching out of my bedroom window because I was very scared. And then I remember maybe 3-4 years later being home alone, all day if I was off ill from school or something, but my father was at work, and that was quite scary. Not quite watching out of the window scary, probably more so staying away from the window. But I feel like Brick, being 10, that's quite a young age still. I'm not saying he can't stay home alone, but I can see Frankie's argument. And eventually she gives in. And she says she'll be, I think, 24 minutes. And in that time, we have a montage of Brick causing quite a lot of chaos in a very short space of time because he finished his book. And I have to say, completely agree. If I have a good book, I'm absolutely fine. If not, I need some kind of distraction. And he ends up almost burning the house down by turning on the oven, and the comforter, the blanket, was in there. And obviously that's enough for Frankie to realise Brick can't stay home alone, and he has to go to the car wash with her. And in the car wash, they start arguing about things, about Brick staying home, and then the foam starts shooting into the windows because they forgot to roll the windows up. And I'd say within about 10 seconds, their squeals of horror have turned into squeals of delight, and they're just embracing the situation and the madness. And they have a lovely heart-to-heart in the bathroom afterwards as Frankie is helping Brick dry off, and she confesses that the real reason she doesn't want him to stay home alone is, apart from the fire incident, probably because he's the youngest. He's the last one to grow up, and she wants to hold on to that, which is, it's fair enough. And I think she came up with a good rule. She told him that he can stay home alone when he learns to tie his shoe. And apparently it took 10 months. And I really like that because it's incentivizing Brick to learn to do something with which he struggles. And I think for any child, that would be great incentive. Maybe I had an incentive like that. I've got absolutely no idea. I can't remember. But I do think telling a child, once you prove you're grown up enough by doing X or Y, then we can revisit this. And I think that's pretty great, and it seemed to work well. And then, as I said, we come back to Axel. And I really like this as well because it turns out Axel can't grow a beard. It's barely face fuzz. And the guys turn up with a rather thick beard each, and Axel shuts the door and he asks Frankie if she'll have his back if he tells them that she forbade him from growing facial hair. And she said, yes, if you do something for me. And he ends up being roped into doing errands instead. And what I particularly like about this is that it shows Axel still needs his mother. Granted, he's using her to lie to somebody else, but he still needs her, and I thought that was lovely. I really enjoyed this. Personal highlights would be, well, just Mike in general. I just thought he was amazing. I think he's often really getting emotional at this. I think he's often a source of a lot of emotion, because when he shows his emotions, it's so easy to get drawn into them because it doesn't happen that often. I mean, it probably happens a little bit each episode, but it's rare that his emotions are the driving force behind a lot of the narrative, and that's exactly what happens here. Usually it's Frankie's heightened emotions that drive things forward. So for Mike to really take charge of basically half of the episode and do it so wonderfully, with comedy, but also sentiment as well, and really beautiful heartfelt moments, and it's just wonderful. So Mike is fabulous, and Brick's staying at home alone montage, and then the car wash scene and the heart-to-heart at the end, and Axel asking Frankie for her help as well. It's a brilliant episode. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. Errand Boy is a really delightful episode of The Middle.